Welcome back to Advancing with Watercolor. Today we're going to look at approaching a very complex and sometimes overwhelming subject. Standing in Times Square, day 4 of our workshop in New York City. Times Square, as you know, is one of the busiest places in New York, maybe throughout the world. It's a place where a lot of people come and enjoy the sights, take in a show, do some shopping. It's just a very, very busy place. This is a tonal study that I've developed on site, representing Times Square, looking down at Times Square and isolating some of the signage above. And as I finish up my drawing, I'm starting my approach with just a wash of wet water. I want to get some very pale colors to represent some of the signage that we see. And these will be the lighter parts of the painting, so I'm stating them early and using what I would consider pretty pure hues. They're not very grayed. And this is to kind of set the stage for creating those that variety of billboards that you see when you stand in Times Square. They kind of look down upon you. They're all, I believe, sort of almost like a plasma TV now, because they tend to glow. And at night it's quite spectacular because they're casting a glow onto the lower part of the sidewalk and the city. It creates a really, for the visually oriented person, it's almost overwhelming because they're of the nature of the lights and how many they are. And then you add in the buildings, which are beautiful, as well as the architecture. So I'm starting with light washes to just identify some of the lighter areas that I'll cut around when I go into my deeper grays. And allows me to kind of set the big parts of the signage. It's all random. I'm not following the photo at all. At this point, I'm just kind of placing colors as I think they look good. And this sort of freedom to do it as you see fit is enjoyable in the beginning. It gives you a place to start. You don't feel overly committed to any one part. You're working with light hues, so these can always be adjusted. And you're working on top of a drawing, so maybe that's what's giving me a little freedom here. Is the drawing has taken a bit of time to put together, and I've focused on the distant Times Square building and kind of surrounded it with larger buildings coming towards us, a big sidewalk, and the road that leads down into Manhattan, lower Manhattan. The area itself of Times Square has changed a lot over the years. The way it is now is kind of good for our group, good for anybody who wants to do any sort of painting down there, because they've set up tables and chairs. They've made it into basically a pedestrian area. And if you can get used to the noise and the visual noise, you can actually have a good experience painting there. Our group enjoyed it very much, and they were a little nervous about it, because when you think painting in Times Square, you think, oh, how can you possibly manage such a complex area? But once you get started, those hesitations fall away, and you just start looking at your subject and finding a way through it. So that's what I've been doing. I placed the lighter washes, tried to give a little bit of a glow in the lower section with yellow ochre, some local color on the cabs. But this next passage is a little more involved, a little more complex, because I'm now working around those areas, trying to turn them into lights. I'm also working with darker grays to create the feeling of buildings. My strategy here is to place more emphasis on the lower third of the painting, where I have the figures coming through. So I'm intentionally keeping the grays in the background rather light and of a cool nature so that they will recede. So as I build this part of the painting, as I come down, getting darker and darker, and then towards the bottom, it's going to get even richer with color, richer with dark shapes, and finally richer with figures. Staying pretty much with a larger brush here. As I work down below and I need more definition, I'll switch to a smaller brush. But you can see the brushwork is oriented towards the signage at the moment. Large washes coming down from the top, changing their value, changing their hue. And as it comes to bear on the eye level, the horizon, I'm flattening it out and will then start to work in the lower section. So it helps to have certainly it helps to have a bit of a plan, and it helps to think in large areas. And right now I'm kind of joining the center area with the right-handed area, a building which is closer, so I'm moving to the darker side of the palette and putting in a few more grays. And as I bring these down, or I'm sorry, as I bring it up, I'm very conscious of fading it off or letting it get a little bit lighter, as though it's almost disappearing into a fog. This is helping me to create a feeling of distance, or even a little bit of weather, a little bit of overcast feeling. And this kind of simple block-in approach is perfect for creating the signage, an allusion to the signage. The angles of the signage, pay attention on those, because those are helping me to create the perspective that we feel in Times Square, kind of the very enhanced perspective where the buildings are looming over you. Everything is kind of focused towards the main building at the end. And the way that I'm shaping the signage is what's creating that almost canyon-like effect. And I'm joining a little bit to the foreground. I'm not going to be too dark in the foreground, as this is sort of my stage area. I want the figures that I place on top to read very clearly, so I'm keeping it lighter. At this point, it's just a way to connect the middle tone, the large middle tone that's running throughout the painting. This is you just heard me mention a large mid-tone. This is a strategy that's really helpful when you're working with a complex subject, because you can squint your eyes and see similarities in shapes, or especially in the darkness of shapes, the tonality of shapes. This similarity, if you can bring it about in your painting, will give a simpler approach, especially helpful when you're working on a complex scene. It'll also integrate the variety of tones and colors that you're using. So if you can think tonally for a minute, and especially about what we call a big mid-tone, you'll have more success more often with your artwork, with your watercolors. While it's wet, there's a little bit of opportunity, and I'm trying to take advantage of that by adding even thicker darks to this near building. These darks that I'm using, most of the grays that I'm using are fashioned out of burnt sienna and a little bit of ultramarine blue. In the foreground, I've used a little more burnt sienna. In the background, a little more blue. This warm color, warm hue, will come closer, will advance towards us, will give the illusion of coming forward. The cool hues will tend to recede a bit. You can see that starting to take shape. So look how I've connected these three sections, building on the right, center building, and now the foreground a bit, by means of grays. And the grays are varied. And now I'm working on some of the edges so that I get some lost and found edges to the shapes that I've left there. They're all reading a little bit too sharp, a little bit too well defined for my taste, so I go back in with a smaller brush and maybe add a little water to the side or drag more paint over the sign to kind of obscure it. All sorts of ways to go at the edges. Now I'm moving over to the left-hand side with a similar approach. Similar grays. I want to keep it, as I said, sort of light above so that we feel like it's almost a cloud city, like New York is living, the top of New York is in the clouds. That helps to create a feeling of the immense size, the scale that we're looking at. And it is a sort of overwhelming place in terms of scale. Until we place a few figures in there, we're not quite sure of the scale, but when we place a couple figures walking through the scene or have a little clearer recognition of a car, a taxi or something like that, it'll give us a real strong feeling of scale. It'll kind of work to make the scale almost feel overwhelming. Building up the buildings on the left side in the same manner. There may be a little bit of neutral tint in this left side. I want to bring this left side even a little closer so that we have sort of a stacking order or a feeling of different depth in the painting. This will be closer to us, so the contrast will be a little stronger. And the building on the right-hand side, a little more distant. And certainly the building in the distance is going to feel even further away. That's one of the goals that I have from the beginning, is to create depth in the painting this way. Those initial colors that we place now are starting to assume a feeling of illuminated signs. And how much do we do with the signage? I guess that's sort of up to the artist. For me, they will probably not be developed much more than this. I might go back in and soften edges or put a little texture into a sign, but I won't put, for example, the writing or the imagery that's shown on the sign. I feel that in my case, I would like to keep that part sort of simple, unless one of the companies decides they want to pay me a crazy amount of money, then I'll definitely put their logo into one of the signs and feel good about it. But as they are now, they're all kind of just blank colors, and for me, that's enough. I would like to feel like some of them are glowing, so that's one of the reasons I painted the colors in the beginning, so that some of the color might bleed out and into the sidewalk or onto the adjacent building. And it's happening a bit in the back there with that orange color. I would like to take advantage of that so that there's a feeling of sort of a glowing color. Now we're coming down to what I feel is one of the difficult passages, and it's making sure that we get a read of these taxis. And I'm doing that primarily by the whites that I leave, which would be the windshields. And I'm going into it and finding a crosswalk, identifying a taxi that's coming into the picture, and I'll play on that a bit, but they're going to be identified primarily through a little bit of yellow color coming through, the shape of the windshield, and taillights. We'll put some taillights on towards the end to give us a little more recognition of these taxis that are kind of squished into the narrow passage of Times Square. Well, you can kind of start to see what the painting is going to look like. The buildings are in place, the atmosphere above is nearly done. I don't think I'll be adding anything to the white of the paper in the sky. I will be bringing in figures at some point, and I will be refining some of the signage. I'm even going to introduce a little color made by Holbein that's a fluorescent color. I'm not sure how it's going to work out in the end, but I'm curious to see if I put some on that triangular working sign, men at work, or I think it's a road that narrows type of sign, that square sign that's on its edge in the distance towards the center of the painting. I'm going to use a little fluorescent color there and see how it works. If I like it, I'll maybe put some more into the signage itself or into some of the taillights. It was maybe the third time I've worked in Times Square, and I enjoy it a lot. I think I felt my students were excited, at the same time a little nervous. They didn't know quite what to expect. But they saw me do a painting on site from this location, and nothing really terrible happened. We had a few tourists come up to us with curiosity. That was about it. And I worked pretty quickly. I didn't record that one, but we worked pretty quickly, and I got a painting, that black and white image that you saw at the beginning. And I did want to do a color one, but it was getting a little late, so I decided to do this one back at the studio and kind of build on my experience in Times Square that particular week. So as I'm painting, I'm kind of watching out of the side of my eye to see if anybody's, like a security guard, is getting nervous, or if there's any sort of reason for alarm to stop what I'm doing. But it was a pretty calm. Everybody had something to do, something on their plate. They were walking around and enjoying being in New York. A lot of tourists, and we did see the guitar man, and he stopped and posed for us. I won't say any more than that. You have to look him up online. Anyway, working with some figures in the lower part of the painting now, trying to get the feeling of some of the hustle and bustle where figures are just kind of lurching out into the street to cross when they can, or they're hailing a taxi, or they're striding through the scene. My main figures will be coming towards us on the sidewalk, as though they're walking out of Times Square, coming towards us. And I'm going to put some elements to make it feel like a sort of wet sidewalk, maybe as though the rain has just passed over. And I'm using a dark hue. At this stage, I'm using a dark hue to identify the figures. Later on, as this hue is drying, or after it's dried, I'll place some reds, some oranges, blues to distinguish some sort of clothing, some hats, some bags, things like this to give it more authenticity. But at this stage, I'm most interested in their position, how they're moving against the traffic, and how they're coming towards us up the sidewalk. Basically starting with the feeling of the torso, and as that torso finishes, it's we put a few legs on the bottom. Sometimes just having one leg striding towards us is enough. Other times we want a figure walking against the traffic, kind of walking left to right. And in general, we want to create, my strategy with the figures is to choose sort of a central figure and isolate them through putting crowds around, or isolate them as a distinct figure away from the crowds, either front or separated side to side. This attracts the eye. When we see a crowd, we kind of our eye moves quickly through the crowd. When we see a solitary figure, we're curious and we stop to see what's going on. So I'm using that bit of psychology when I think about placing figures and where they will be. I definitely like to have a major figure, a figure that's either closer or doing something that's related to the scene. And I'll flank them with crowds, or I'll have a few figures just coming into the scene. This figure now that I was working on, just coming into the scene and giving us a feeling of depth. So we put figures in the distance a lot. We put a few figures in the midground, and maybe one or two exiting or entering the picture. This is a strategy to create a feeling of depth. And at the same time, we can create sort of a feeling of movement and jostle and the hustle and bustle that we feel in New York City. As they are right now, they're a little hard to see, except for where the leg comes down. But as the paint dries, they'll become more visible. The background will fade off a little bit. And we'll put some color work into the figures, and they'll start to appear. Here you see me placing those reflections. And the reflections, they do stem from the light overhead, right? They do cast almost like a shadow, or it could be just a reflection in a wet surface. In either case, they help to connect these strong darks to the bottom of the painting, and I like the effect that it creates, so I'm using that extensively in the painting. Also using that same idea to quiet this lower corner. You saw the wash I just placed on the lower right-hand corner, kind of blurring the figure and creating a bit of reflection from the buildings. That was intentional, again, to isolate my center of interest and to create a bit of mystery or softness in the corner. Well, it's starting to feel kind of busy, isn't it? A lot of figures walking to and fro. They don't have much identity yet, like we can't really pull out one from the other. We can sort of feel the figures moving through, but we need to do some details. While that's drying, let's work on the signage, public signage. A lot of it in New York, the traffic signs, signals, public lights, men at work signs, in addition to all the advertising that's going on up above. We have this other complexity that I really built on in the black and white painting, and I'm trying to incorporate in this painting, especially up above where it enters that white area of atmosphere, crosses in front of a sign, helps to push that building back. The signage has a purpose. But from this point forward, I'm using a smaller brush, trying to build up some of the brighter colors in the figures, making adjustments to edges and so on. Resolve any part of the painting that I feel is weak or needs a little bit of sharpness. I'm not really going to touch the buildings too much at this point. This is as developed as they will get, but I will work a little more with detail into the figures, into the foreground, into the taxi on the left, and try to finish this lower third of the painting with a little bit of extra detail and nuance. Anyway, if you're an urban painter, if you like street scenes, New York gives you something completely unique. The European cities are wonderful, beautiful. The cities in Asia also have their own magic, a lot of beautiful temples, and their skyscrapers are very unique also. New York represents something a little different, and for me it's closer to home, and I really like the energy of New York City. And something I try to think about as I'm painting, how can I bring out that energy? How can I make it more tangible to the audience? And usually I'm taking some liberties to do that. For example, the buildings are a little closer together. If you walk through there, the spaces between the buildings will be a little more broad. I pushed them together, and I pushed the people together a little more, and I pushed the cars together a little more to give a feeling of edge to edge, something so close to another thing. And this creates a sort of tension, visual tension or psychological tension maybe in the painting. Angling the buildings slightly so they're hovering over us, extreme angles in the signage. All this stuff kind of has an effect on our perception or our physical response to the painting. I would like there to be just a little bit of nervous energy in this piece. Because that's the main reason, is because that was what I was experiencing, sort of tension created by the painting. And you can see the details starting to have an effect onto the figures, a little bit of blue to the shoulders or a little bit of a highlight to a head really starts to make them come out from the scene even more. And it's true, they will be more present, but that overhead signage is really such a dynamic thing that I don't think they will compete with that. Be wonderful if I had some pre-recorded traffic sounds that I could layer over this video so that you'd get a clearer sense of what it's like to stand, oh, I'm sure you know, what it's like to stand in Times Square and hear all the layers of sound. If I could incorporate the street vendors into this, and the smoke and the smell of the sausages, I would do that too, because that's all a part of the experience. Something that comes back to me as I'm watching this painting develop is all of those things that maybe have receded from my memory. They kind of come back when I'm looking at the painting. Well, we're coming up to the last stages, and nothing extreme will happen at this point, just sort of the refinement of the figures and so on.